I knew something was off that day from the moment the glass doors looked at me like I didn't belong there anymore. You know that kind of silence in an office when something is wrong. Not the quiet, productive kind, but the kind where everything is still moving and somehow muted. Like someone just said something they shouldn't have, and everyone decided to pretend it didn't happen. That was exactly what it felt like when I walked in. No laughter from the pantry, no rapid typing. Even the coffee machine that usually sounded like an irritated animal every morning was quiet in a way that didn't feel normal. There were only eyes, a lot of eyes. And the interesting part was that every single one of them avoided me. Someone walked past, staring at their phone as their inbox had exploded. Another turned away a little too fast. One person even changed direction just to avoid walking past me. I paused for a second, not because I was shocked, but because I realized something. This wasn't something about to happen. It had already happened. I kept walking toward the access gate out of habit, right hand reaching for my badge, a motion I had done hundreds of times before. I tapped it. A short, cold beep. Access denied. I looked at the badge, then at the scanner, like if I stared long enough, it would correct itself. It didn't. I tried again. Another beep. Access denied. This time, before I could try a third time, someone stepped in. Sorry you can't enter. The voice was flat and precise with no hesitation. I turned and saw security. Not someone I recognized. Of course. Big changes never start with big things. They start when you no longer recognize the person at the door. I work here, I said calmly, like I was stating something obvious. He didn't argue, didn't react, just repeated, almost word for word. Sorry you can't enter. I tilted my head slightly, not annoyed, just curious. Then I think someone should explain what's going on. He didn't respond. He just looked past my shoulder. That was when I heard heels. Not fast, not rushed, but the kind of steps that assume the room will move out of the way. I turned and saw HR. Leading them was a young woman holding an iPad, like it were the only thing keeping her steady. She held it a little too high, with both hands, tight shoulders, slightly tense. She didn't want to be here. She stopped in front of me. No greeting, no smile. She didn't even look at me right away. She looked down at the screen, took a breath, then started reading. Based on the decision of the executive board, we hereby inform you that your employment is terminated effective immediately. No explanation, no reason. Just a clean sentence delivered with the precision of something that had been rehearsed. I looked at her, and that was when she finally looked up. I saw it immediately. A slight tremble in her hand. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But I was. Because I had been in that position before. Holding a decision you don't fully believe in. Reading something you know might be wrong. Who signed this, I asked. Calm, steady, no pressure in my voice. She opened her mouth, then stopped. Her eyes shifted left, then right, like she was looking for an exit in a room that didn't have one. We're just following instructions, she said finally. Of course, it is always instructions, never responsibility. I nodded slightly, not because I agreed, but because I had the answer I needed. Around us, the air grew heavier. No one said anything, but I could hear everything. Typing stopped mid-keystroke. A chair moved slightly. Some people didn't even dare look up. It felt like a perfectly staged scene, and somehow I had been placed at the center of it without being asked. I looked down at the badge in my hand. A small piece of plastic is used to open every door in this building. Now it didn't. Interesting. A company can change a lot overnight, or at least they think it can. I handed the badge back to her. She hesitated for a second before taking it. Her fingers brushed mine, and I felt that same slight tremor again. She knew. Not everything, but enough to know something wasn't right. I looked at her a moment longer, not accusing, not upset, just observing. You should document this process carefully, I said. She blinked clearly, not understanding, or maybe not wanting to. I turned and walked away. No one stopped me. No one said anything. And somehow the way out behind me felt easier than the way in ever had. I stepped outside, and the light felt brighter than I remembered. Or maybe everything inside had just become darker. The glass door closed behind me with a soft click, clean and final, like the end of a sentence. I stood there for a second, just long enough to breathe, long enough to think, long enough to smile. Not because everything was okay, but because everything had just become interesting. I never made it to my office that day. I never logged in. I never even started, and somehow they had already erased me. I looked at him for a moment and said nothing. I did not argue. I did not push back. I simply observed because there is a very specific kind of confidence people have when they are newly handed power, not because they understand the system, but because they believe the system is on their side. And in that moment, he believed it completely. I could see it in the way he stood, in the way he spoke, in the way he did not even consider the possibility that he might be wrong. So I just nodded slightly and said, got it calm and casual, like we were talking about a meeting schedule instead of the fact that I had just been removed from something I helped build. She tilted her head a little, almost confused by the lack of reaction. No anger, no resistance, no scene, and somehow that unsettled them. More than anything I could have said. Good. She replied, her tone clean and controlled. Then we do not have to make this any more uncomfortable than it needs to be. He turned slightly and gave the order without even looking at anyone directly, just loud enough for the entire floor to hear. IT makes sure all her access is revoked. Everything, email servers, cloud, all of it. A young engineer in the corner straightened, immediately hands already moving toward the keyboard. Yeah, okay, he said, but his eyes stayed on me for a moment longer before dropping back to the screen and double check. She added, this time looking straight at him. I do not want any trace left, trace that word, again, not account, not data trace, like I had never been part of the system at all. Just something that slipped through and now needed to be cleaned out. I leaned slightly and looked past them into the workspace. People who had avoided my eyes earlier were no longer pretending some stared down. Some froze mid-movement, and one face I recognized stood still just a little too long. He had worked directly with me in the early days. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then he lowered his head, not because he did not recognize me, but because he did, and that was exactly why he could not hold the gaze. So we are done here, he asked, turning back to me, a hint of impatience now visible in his voice. I looked at him again, not to challenge him, just to remember that is up to you. I said, I have not started anything yet. She let out a small laugh, dismissive, like she had just heard something not worth responding to. You should be grateful. You are still standing here today, she said, her voice light but edged. Not everyone gets to leave quietly. I nodded again, not in agreement, but because that sentence was more revealing than they understood. Statements only carry weight when the person saying them fully understands what they mean, and here they clearly did not. Let us wrap this up, he said, giving a small signal with his hand that was enough. Security stepped forward, not blocking this time, just moving closer. A hand rested on my shoulder. Not rough, not aggressive, but clear time to go. For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to pause, not because the action was dramatic, but because it was final. This was no longer a decision on paper, this was reality. I looked down at the hand on my shoulder, then back up. No irritation, no resistance. Just acknowledgement, not necessary, I said quietly. The guard hesitated for a second, then pulled his hand away. Not because I told him to, but because something about the situation no longer felt as simple as it had a moment ago. I turned and walked away this time for real. I did not look back. There was no reason to. I had already seen everything I needed to see. As I walked through the workspace again, the silence felt heavier than before. No one pretended anymore. No one looked up. But I knew they were watching, not with their eyes, but with their attention, as I passed the colleague from earlier. He was still standing there, head down, but just before I moved completely past him, he glanced up slightly, just enough for me to see, just enough for him to know I noticed. Then he lowered his gaze again, not out of fear, but because there was nothing else he could do. I walked out. No one stopped me. No one spoke. No more orders. No more statements. It was done. The glass doors opened and then closed behind me, the same sound, clean and cold. But this time, it did not feel like an ending. It felt unfinished, like something had only just begun. Through the glass, I could still see inside, people returning to work, IT typing faster, as if speed could hide uncertainty. HR already gone, the new CEO and his wife standing close together, talking about something I could not hear, but did not need to. They believed it was over, and that was the most interesting part, because from their perspective, I had just been erased. No access, no permissions, no role, no position, no relevance, a line of data removed. A name crossed off a problem, solved clean, efficient, completely wrong. I stood there for another second, then turned away. No need to look back, no need to check, no need to confirm, because there is one thing I know for certain: you cannot erase something when you are not the one who created it. And right now, in front of everyone, they believed they had removed me from the company. But the truth is, they had just tried to erase something they never actually understood in the first place. I walked out of the building without looking back, not because I did not care, but because there was nothing behind me that needed confirming anymore. Whatever needed to happen had already happened, and the rest no longer depended on whether I stood there or not. And if you have spent enough time around systems, you understand something. Simple, real power does not belong to the person present. It belongs to what keeps running after you are gone. Right before stepping fully outside, I said one thing, not loud, not emphasized, just enough for the right people to hear. Make sure this entire process is properly documented. No one responded, no one asked questions. But I knew that sentence would not disappear with me, because the right words, said at the right moment, tend to last longer than the person who said them. The glass door closed behind me with a clean click, and this time it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a switch, like a condition had just been satisfied, like a line of logic had just been triggered without anyone needing to see it happen. I stepped onto the sidewalk, and the light outside felt brighter than usual, or maybe everything inside had just gotten darker. I did not stop for long, just enough to take a breath, then I kept walking, like nothing unusual had happened. But behind me, inside that building, things were already shifting. There was no noise, no drama, no one shouting that the system was broken, just small details, the kind most people would miss if they did not know what to look for in the IT area. The young engineer who had just been told to revoke all my access was staring at his screen with full concentration. At first, everything went exactly as expected. Account disabled email, locked permissions, removed step by step, clean, precise. A perfect process until it was not. A log appeared, then vanished too quickly. A permission that had just been removed returned to its previous state. Not completely, not clearly, but enough to make him stop. That is strange, he muttered more to himself than anyone else. He tried again. Delete, confirm, enter 1 second, 2 seconds. The screen refreshed. Nothing changed. He sat up straighter, typing faster now. Not in a steady rhythm anymore, but in the way someone types when they are trying to prove the system is wrong and not them. He went deeper into the permission layers through levels no one normally touches. And that was when he saw it, not my name. Not a recognizable account, just an ID with no label. No email. No metadata sitting at the highest level of the system root. He froze for a moment. Not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well. You do not delete. Root is what everything else is built around. If you can delete it, then the system itself stops being a system. Can you come take a look at this? He called out, his voice lower but tighter than before. The manager walked over, slightly annoyed at first. But after a few seconds looking at the screen, his expression changed. What is this? He asked. Even though the question did not really need an answer, I cannot remove it. The engineer said no one can. The manager corrected quietly, his eyes still fixed on that line. In HR, the woman who had read the termination notice was finishing the process. The form was complete. All she had to do was submit. She clicked loading 1 second, 2 seconds. The screen turned gray with a simple message, action pending. She tried again. Same result. This time she said nothing, just stared at the screen a little longer, like it might explain itself if she waited long enough. Across the office floor, the signs began to spread. A shared file would not open, a dashboard froze mid-load. A permission that had just been changed reverted back without anyone touching it. No one stood up to ask what was happening. No one made noise, but everyone felt it like a shift in temperature without a sound to warn you. In the corner office, the new CEO glanced at his phone when a notification appeared. Short direct permission update failed. He tried the same action again. No response. What is going on? His wife asked. Just a system issue, he replied quickly. Too quickly, like speed alone could keep things under control. Back in IT, the manager took a step back. Do not touch it anymore, he said. But if it is broken, do not. His voice was not loud, but it was final, because there are things in a system that get worse the more you try to fix them. That account remained there unchanged and unaffected. It did not resist. It did not need to. It simply existed outside the range they could control. Outside, I kept walking at a steady pace. I did not need to turn around to know what was happening. Systems built the right way do not need their creator standing there to manage them. They run, they react, they adjust. I stopped at the corner and looked back at the building once more. From the outside, everything still looked normal. No one running out, no one shouting, no visible crisis. But if you knew where to look, you could see it, Something had just been activated, and the most interesting part was this: they thought they were fixing a problem. I smiled slightly, not because I had won, but because everything was working exactly as it was supposed to from the moment they read that decision in front of me. Everything had already slipped out of their control. And if anyone inside that building was calm enough to stop and really look, they would realize something simple. The system was not broken, it was responding. Inside the building, no one stood up or announced there was a problem. There were no urgent emails, no flashing alerts, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was hard to name, and that was exactly what made people uncomfortable. The most dangerous things in a company are not the obvious failures, but the moments when something feels wrong without being clear enough for anyone to say it out loud. At first, it showed up in small details that were easy to ignore: someone staring at their screen a little too long, someone refreshing a file for the third time with no result, someone quietly asking, "Can you open that file?" The words sounded normal, but the look in their eyes did not. The reply came just as quiet: "No, it is still stuck," and then silence again. But this time it did not fade. It spread from desk to desk, from question to question. "The dashboard is not loading. My access just reset. Is anyone else seeing this?" No one raised their voice. No one wanted to be the first to admit something was wrong, but enough people were seeing the same thing that the silence grew heavier. Then someone said softly, almost like thinking out loud, "When did this even start?" The person next to them paused, not because they did not know, but because they were not sure they should say it. They began, then stopped. They did not need to finish the sentence, both of them already knew, and somehow saying less made the answer clearer. In IT, the atmosphere had changed completely. No casual conversations, no background music, just the sound of typing and lines of logs running across screens. The young engineer sat straighter now, eyes locked on the display, no longer just completing a task, but trying to understand what was happening. The manager stood behind him, arms crossed, watching in silence for a few long moments before speaking. "Go deeper," he said. The engineer opened layers no one usually touched. Not the familiar interface, but the core of the system itself. Data filled the screen. Dense and difficult to read, but precise. He pulled the timeline back, step by step. "Here," he said, voice slower. "Now this account is not new." "How long?" the manager asked. The engineer paused for a second, scanning the timestamps. "A long time," he said, "before some of the current systems even existed." The manager did not respond right away. He studied the screen a moment longer before asking who has permission to modify it. It was a simple question with no simple answer. The engineer went through the permissions line by line, then shook his head. "No one. We do not have access. We do not need higher clearance, just no one." Across the office floor, the whispers shifted. It was no longer just about technical issues. She did not react at all. Someone said quietly, "Yeah." Someone else replied, "If that were me, I would have argued, or at least asked why." Another added, "But she did nothing." And that was what made it worse. People expect reactions, and when there is none, they start asking questions. And once the questions begin, certainty starts to break. In one corner, the employee who had looked at me earlier and then lowered his head was no longer pretending to work. He stood still, not looking at his screen, but somewhere further away, like he was trying to remember something he had not thought about in a long time. "Do you remember the early days?" he asked quietly. "Early days," of what the other person replied. "When the company first built the system before everything was standardized." The other person shook their head. "I was not here back then." He nodded slightly. She was. A pause followed. "What are you saying?" the other asked. He hesitated, then said, "I am not sure, but there are things in this system that were not built by the current team." That thought did not spread like gossip, but it stayed in the minds of the people who heard it. And sometimes that is enough to change how everything looks. In the corner office, the new CEO was still trying to hold control, but small cracks were showing. He checked his phone more often, repeated the same action even after it failed, and his voice moved a little faster when he gave orders. "Fix this," he said. "We are checking," the IT manager replied. "Do not check, fix it," he insisted. The manager looked at him for a second longer than usual, then said, "If this were a bug, it would already be fixed." The sentence was quiet, but heavy enough to pull the air down in the room. Back in IT, the screen still showed that account unchanged, unmoved, unaffected. It did not resist, it did not need to. It simply existed outside anything they could control, and what unsettled them was not that they could not delete it, but that they were starting to understand why. From outside, the building still looked completely normal. No signs of chaos, no visible crisis. But inside, those who were calm enough to really observe had begun to realize something. Not everything in a system belongs to the people currently running it, and not everything can be erased just because someone decides it should be. Some things are built long before designed to outlast layers of leadership, and when you touch them, you do not break them, you trigger them. And if anyone there was clear enough to see a little deeper, they would come to a simple but uncomfortable truth. Some things in a system exist longer than the people in charge of it. Inside the building, while most people were still trying to piece together scattered signs into something that made sense, something else was already happening on another level, a level most of them had never even seen. There were no alerts, no announcements, no one standing up to explain anything. It was just a process, activating exactly the way it had been designed, precise to the point where it felt almost cold. It started with an email. Not the kind with a clear sender or a reply chain, not something someone sat down and decided to send. It simply appeared at the same time in the inbox of every board member with a subject line that was too direct to ignore automated governance alert, immediate review required. Emails like that rarely bring good news. One of them opened the attachment almost automatically. "What is this?" he asked, but the question became unnecessary the moment the document loaded. It was clean structured, no extra wording, no ambiguity, and most importantly, every piece of data was time-stamped down to the second. This was not something written in a rush. This was something prepared in advance, waiting for the right moment. The first page had only one line: termination procedure compliance violation detected. No one spoke for a few seconds, not because they did not understand, but because they were reading faster than usual, eyes moving with the urgency of people who knew this mattered. The next page did not explain, it showed names, time, signatures, execution steps. Everything aligned against the internal policy, line by line. One line stood out: authorization level mismatch. Someone looked up. The signer did not have authority. No one answered, because the document already had no debate, no interpretation, just a fact presented in a way that could not be argued. The following page lists conditions and triggers. A section marked clearly: in the event of unauthorized executive action resulting in unlawful termination, decision authority will be immediately suspended, and control will be reassigned to the highest verified shareholder. The room changed before anyone finished reading. Chairs shifted slightly, breathing slowed. No one interrupted. The silence was no longer neutral. It was the kind that comes when everyone reaches the same conclusion, but no one wants to be the first to say it. Who is the largest shareholder right now? Someone finally asked, voice lower than before. The assistant pulled up the records, movements quick, but no longer confident. Based on the latest data, she began, then paused just long enough for the room to notice. "Who?" someone pressed. She looked up, not because she did not know, but because the answer did not match what anyone expected. "It is her." The silence that followed was heavier. No one moved, no one argued. Not immediately. "That cannot be right," someone said instinctively. "She was just fired." Another voice came slower, steadier. "No, she was unlawfully terminated." Those two things sound similar, but inside a system they are completely different. The next page showed a single line: control reassignment completed. Not pending, not under review. Completed. "When did this happen?" someone asked. The assistant checked the timestamp. The moment the decision was recorded in the system. Not when someone noticed, not when someone reported it. The moment it happened, automatic, unstoppable. No approval required from anyone in that room. Downstairs, the new CEO was still standing in his office, repeating the same action again, the screen still unresponsive. "Fix this," he said, but this time the confidence in his voice had thinned. No one answered right away, not because they did not hear him, but because they were no longer sure what exactly needed fixing. In IT, the manager stepped back. He was no longer looking at the screen. He was thinking. "Stop," he said. "Do not touch anything else." No one argued, because experience teaches you when something is no longer a technical issue. Across the office floor, the whispers disappeared, not because people understood everything, but because they felt something bigger than what they could explain. A shift without noise, but impossible to ignore. In the boardroom, the document remained open. No one closed it. No one asked what comes next because there was no next step left to take. It had already been executed. One of them finally spoke slow and certain. "We are not the ones making this decision." No one disagreed. Outside, I stood at the corner of the street, not rushing, not checking my phone, not doing anything that looked important. I did not need confirmation. I did not need to wait for results. From the moment they read that decision in front of me, everything had already been decided. Not by me, by the system. And the system does not care about titles or emotions. It only cares about conditions. The condition had been met. The result had been executed. And the most interesting part was that they still believed they had fired me. I smiled slightly, not out of surprise, but because everything was working exactly as it was supposed to. If anyone inside that building was calm enough to read that document all the way through and honest enough to accept what it showed, they would realize something simple. They did not fire me. They activated my authority. At the top floor in the room that used to be where final decisions were made, the silence was still there. But this time it did not feel like a meeting anymore. It felt like a decryption. No one argued. No one tried to defend their position. Because the document in front of them did not leave much room for opinion. It did not tell a story. It presented facts. And the more they read, the clearer everything became in a way that was deeply uncomfortable. One of them finally spoke slowly, eyes still fixed on the screen. "She is not just a shareholder. It was not a guess. It was a conclusion." The following pages did not stop at pointing out violations. They expanded into structure, into how the company was actually built, and more importantly, into the person who designed it. A diagram appeared. Not a standard org chart, but a map of real power. Layers stacked on top of each other, intersections, and control mechanisms that were never visible on the surface. And at the center of all of it was a name that just minutes ago had been treated as removed. Someone asked quietly, "She designed this." No one answered, but the document did. A section was marked clearly, Original Governance Architecture Revision Log. The timeline moved backward further than anyone in that room expected, further than some of the systems they were currently using. "When did this even start?" someone asked. The assistant scrolled through the timestamps and stopped at one point. "During the restructuring phase 3 years ago." Someone nodded slowly. That was when the company almost collapsed. No one disagreed. No one needed to repeat the details. But everyone remembered. A time when decisions stopped following logic and started following relationships, when power did not belong to capability but to connection. Someone muttered the CEO's family. No one said a name. They did not need to. He signed things he should never have signed. One person added. And no one could stop him, another finished. That was not a system failure. That was a structural failure. And when the structure is wrong, everything built on top of it follows. The room fell silent again. But this time, the silence carried recognition. "She fixed it," someone said. Not a question, not a theory, just a statement of fact. The next section confirmed it, not with explanations, but with changes. New clauses, automated mechanisms, trigger conditions that did not depend on people. A system designed not for when things are working, but for when they are not. Someone pointed at the screen. "This clause is not for daily use." Another replied, "No, it is for exactly this kind of situation." Someone leaned back in their chair, exhaling slowly. So she saw this coming. No one disagreed because everything in front of them proved it. This was not a reaction. This was preparation, not a coincidence. Design. Downstairs, the new CEO was still trying to understand why nothing was behaving the way he expected. He did not see the document, the diagram, or the history. He only saw the outcome, and an outcome means nothing if you do not understand the cause. "What is going on?" he said, this time unable to keep his voice steady. No one answered. Not because they did not know, but because they were starting to understand and did not know how to explain it. In IT, the manager stood still, no longer looking at the screen, but beyond it, seeing a bigger picture. "This is not a bug," he said quietly, almost to himself. "This is a mechanism." The young engineer said nothing, but his expression showed that he was beginning to understand not everything, but enough to know that they were not the ones in control of this system. Across the office floor, the whispers had stopped, not because everyone understood everything, but because they could feel something larger than what they could explain, a shift that made no sound but was impossible to ignore. Back upstairs, the document was nearly finished. There were not many pages left, but what needed to be known was already clear. "So all of this," one person started, then stopped. "It is not luck," another finished. No one disagreed. If it were luck, it would not be this precise. If it were a coincidence, it would not happen at this exact moment. One of them looked at the final line and read it slowly, making sure they understood it correctly. Preventive governance mechanism designed to eliminate unauthorized control. He nodded slightly. She did not just work in this company, he said. She built it in a way that allows it to protect itself. The room fell into silence one last time, but this time it was no longer confusion. It was acceptance. Outside, I stood at the corner of the street, my eyes passing over the building once more. Nothing had changed on the surface. There were no visible signs of what had just happened inside. But I knew. I did not need to look. I did not need to check. Because the system had done exactly what it was designed to do. No more, no less. And most importantly, it did not need me to be there to do it. I smiled slightly, not out of surprise, but because everything was unfolding exactly as expected. And if anyone inside that building was clear enough to look past the outcome and see the cause, they would understand something simple. This was not luck. This was not a reaction. This was a system built long before waiting for exactly this moment. This was never luck. This was designed. The emergency meeting was called faster than usual, but no one said that out loud. There was no long email, no clear agenda, just a short notice that was enough to make everyone with authority show up. And the interesting part was that when they walked into that room this time, no one was entirely sure they still belonged in that group anymore. The new CEO arrived earlier than everyone else, not out of initiative, but because he did not have a choice. He stood next to the table instead of sitting down, his phone still in his hand, out of habit, even though the screen had been off for a while. His wife stood beside him, quieter than before. Her expression no longer as sharp as it had been earlier, not because she had changed, but because the situation had. "What is this about?" he asked as people began to enter his voice, still trying to hold control, but no longer as steady. No one answered right away, not because they did not know, but because the answer was no longer simple. The IT manager came in, among the last, not avoiding eye contact, not confronting it, either simply not needing to. He set his laptop down, opened it, and said nothing. "You have all seen the document." One board member finally said, his voice low but enough to quiet the room. The CEO turned. "What document?" No one explained. The laptop was turned toward him. The file was still open, unchanged exactly as it had been sent. No updates, no edits. He looked at the screen. 1 second, 2 seconds, then longer. His first reaction was not panic, it was disbelief. "This does not make sense," he said quickly. "We followed the correct procedure. No one argued. No one needed to. I signed that decision as CEO," he added firmer this time, as if logic could pull control back into his hands. A board member shook his head slightly. "The issue is not that you signed it," he said. "It is that you did not have the authority to." Silence settled in. "That is impossible," he replied immediately. "I am the CEO." "Not anymore," the answer came back. The sentence did not need volume to land. It hit anyway. "Your authority was suspended the moment the system recorded that decision," the IT manager said, speaking for the first time, his tone calm in a way that made it harder to argue with. "Not by us, not by the board, by the system itself." The CEO looked around the room, searching for someone to support him. No one did, not because they did not want to, but because they could not. "Then who has authority now?" he asked, his voice lower but tighter. No one answered, because the answer was not in the room yet. The door opened. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a normal movement. I walked in. No rush, no need to scan the room. I already knew they were watching. Not with their eyes, but with their attention. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed my hands on the table as if this were just another meeting I had attended countless times before. No emotion, no anger, no need to prove anything. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then he straightened slightly. "You do not have authority here," he said, the same sentence as before. But this time it was no longer true. I looked at him. Did not respond immediately. Just let the statement sit in the air for a moment. "Authority does not belong to the person who signs the decision," I said calmly. "It belongs to the person who writes the rules." No one interrupted. No one disagreed, because that sentence explained everything. He opened his mouth about to say something, then stopped. Not because he had nothing to say, but because there was nothing left to stand on. I was not fired. I continued, my tone unchanged. I simply confirmed who did not have the authority. The line landed softer than the one before it, but sharper. Not because of what it said, but because of when it was said. A board member gave a slight nod. Not to me, but to reality. The suspension is already in effect, he said, looking at the former CEO. From the moment the clause was triggered, no vote, no discussion, no agreement required. Everything had already been decided before this meeting even started. He did not sit down again. He remained standing, but his posture had changed. No longer the one controlling the room, but the one trying to understand why he could not anymore. This is not over, he said, but the confidence was gone. I did not respond. There was no need, because for the system it had been over long before he realized it. One of the board members closed the laptop. Not because the meeting was over, but because there was nothing left to review. You are suspended pending investigation, he said, his tone neutral. No emotion, no personal judgment, just process. The same thing they had assumed they could bypass just a few hours earlier. No one stood up immediately. No one rushed out. But everyone knew the peak had passed. Not because someone had won, but because everything had returned to where it was supposed to be. I stood up last, did not look back, did not need confirmation. Because if there was one thing that had become clear in that room, it was this. Power had not changed. Only the person who understood it had. After the meeting, nothing exploded. No one was dragged out. There was no final argument, or dramatic last words meant to end everything. Everything unfolded the way a real system is supposed to operate, clean cold. And without emotion, the new CEO was not removed in the usual way. He simply no longer existed within the system. His access was revoked. His accounts were disabled. His digital signature no longer carried any authority. His name could still appear on old documents, but in anything that actually functioned, he had been removed. His wife left the room first without saying a word or looking back. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything had already been said through data. The former CEO remained standing for a few seconds longer, as if waiting for someone to reverse the decision, or at least offer a different explanation. No one did. Eventually, he turned and walked out. No one stopped him, no one followed. The door closed behind him, and this time the sound did not feel dramatic. It felt like a log entry being recorded complete and requiring no further action. Inside, people slowly returned to work, not instantly, but quickly enough to reveal something important. The system did not need time to recover, it only needed the wrong element removed in IT. The log stabilized access points that had been stuck began functioning again. Frozen dashboards refreshed and displayed data as if nothing had ever been interrupted. No patch was deployed, no bug was fixed. Everything simply returned to the state it was supposed to be in. On the main floor, the whispers disappeared. Not because people forgot what happened, but because they understood enough not to keep talking about it. A few people looked up as I walked out of the meeting room, no longer avoiding me like they had earlier. Not because they suddenly became braver, but because the context had changed. The silence was no longer avoidance, it was respect. I did not stop to talk to anyone. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said had already been said in the right place. I walked past familiar desks and glowing screens that looked exactly the same as they had that morning, but the feeling was completely different. The air felt lighter. There was no tension, no pressure holding it down. I reached the lobby. The glass doors were still there. The scanner was still there. The security guard stood in the same place, but this time no one stopped me. I did not reach for my badge. I did not try again. I did not need to check whether the system recognized me. That had never been the issue. A voice called from behind. I stopped and turned. A board member approached, not the one who spoke the most, but the one who had been watching long enough to understand what had just happened. He walked toward me calmly, without urgency or pressure, and asked if I was coming back. It sounded like a simple question, but it was not about position or title. It was about presence. I looked at him for a moment, not to think of an answer, but to confirm that he understood what he was asking. I could stay, I could walk back, and take control, sign decisions, become the center of everything, again. The system had already given me that authority, and no one in that building could challenge it. But that had never been the goal. Real power is not about where you stand. It is about whether things continue to run the way you design them, even when you are not there. I smiled slightly, not because the question was interesting, but because it was the question everyone eventually asks. At this moment, I told him I never left. He looked at me without reacting immediately. Not because he did not understand, but because it took a second for the meaning to settle. Then I turned and walked away. This time, there was no sound behind me, worth noticing, no clear ending, no defined stopping point, just movement, continuing forward behind me. The building was still there, people were still working, the system was still running, nothing collapsed, nothing needed to be saved because it never needed saving. It only needed to function the way it was designed to. And when a system is built correctly, it does not need a hero. It does not need someone to step in and fix things every time something goes wrong. It handles itself. It adjusts. It removes what does not belong. I kept walking without rushing and without looking back. Not because there was nothing behind me, but because everything behind me was already working exactly the way it should, and that is the only thing that ever really mattered.